There's a number so large it's almost impossible to comprehend. $37 trillion. That's America's national debt right now, in 2025. For every man, woman, and child in this country, that's $110,000 in debt you didn't agree to take on. The interest alone costs $1.2 trillion every single year. That's more than we spend on national defense, more than Medicare. Just the interest on money we've already borrowed. Alan Greenspan warned us in 2010, the United States is on a path it cannot sustain. He was right. What I'm about to show you isn't speculation or fear-mongering. It's mathematics. Within the next 18 to 24 months, America will face a debt crisis that makes 2008 look like a dress rehearsal. The triggers are already appearing. The cascade has already begun. And there is no amount of money in the world large enough to stop what's coming. Let me show you why the fiscal cliff isn't something approaching in the distance. We're already falling. To understand why we're about to go over the cliff, you need to understand what national debt actually is. It's simple. Every year, the government spends more than it collects in taxes. That's called a deficit. Those deficits accumulate over decades into the national debt. The government borrows money by issuing Treasury bonds. Investors buy them. The government promises to pay them back with interest. In theory, debt can be useful. Building infrastructure, defending the nation, investing in education, these things pay returns over time. But that's not what happened. What happened was decades of endless wars, corporate bailouts, tax cuts without spending cuts, and politicians kicking every hard decision down the road. Here's how fast we've been accelerating toward the cliff. In the year 2000, national debt was $5.7 trillion. By 2008, after the Bush tax cuts and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, it hit $10 trillion. Then came the financial crisis. From 2009 to 2016, we added another $9.5 trillion. Obama's response to the Great Recession, stimulus packages, the Affordable Care Act. By the time Trump took office, debt stood at $19.5 trillion. 4 years later, after tax cuts and COVID spending, it reached $27 trillion. And now, in 2025, after Biden's COVID relief packages and infrastructure bills, we're at $37 trillion. Let me put that acceleration in perspective. It took America more than 200 years to accumulate its first $1 trillion in debt. That happened in 1981. It took just 43 years to add the next $36 trillion. In the last 5 years alone, we've added $10 trillion. The borrowing isn't slowing down, it's speeding up. The federal deficit in 2024 was $1.8 trillion. That's 6.3% of GDP. Economists consider anything above 3% unsustainable. We're running deficits double what's considered the danger zone, and there's no plan to stop. Mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, consumes 65% of the entire federal budget. Discretionary spending is 25%. Interest payments are approaching 15% of the budget and rising fast. Here's what nobody wants to admit. We are already past the point where this can be fixed with normal policy. The debt has grown so large and the interest has grown so expensive that we're caught in a trap that has only one exit. And that exit is collapse. Before I show you what's coming, let me show you what already happened, a warning shot that everyone ignored. In August 2011, the United States came within hours of defaulting on its debt. The government had hit the debt ceiling, the legal limit on how much it can borrow. Republicans in Congress refused to raise it unless Democrats agreed to massive spending cuts. Democrats refused. The standoff dragged on for weeks. Financial markets began to panic. Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner later said, "We were staring into the abyss." On August 5, 2011, something happened that had never happened before in American history. Standard & Poor's downgraded the United States credit rating from AAA to AA+. The rating that had been perfect since the country's founding was broken. The stock market collapsed. 2,000 points in 2 weeks. The message was clear. The world's safest investment, U.S. Treasury bonds, was no longer risk-free. The political dysfunction in Washington had made default a real possibility. Eventually, Congress raised the debt ceiling, crisis averted. But here's what that crisis revealed. America's credibility as a borrower had been permanently damaged. Global investors had seen that the U.S. could choose not to pay its debts, not because it lacked the money, but because politicians couldn't agree. The downgrade cost taxpayers $1.3 billion in higher interest payments, according to the Government Accountability Office. And what was the lesson learned from nearly defaulting? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Since 2011, the debt ceiling has been raised or suspended 5 more times. In 2013, in 2017, in 2019, in 2021, in 2023. Each time, the same political theater. Each time, more brinkmanship. Each time, markets get more nervous. And each time, the debt kept growing. When we nearly defaulted in 2011, the national debt was $14.3 trillion. Today, it's $37 trillion. We've added $22.7 trillion in 13 years. That's more than 2.5 times the total debt accumulated in the previous 220 years of American history. The debt ceiling will need to be raised again in early 2025. Congress is more divided now than it was in 2011. The next standoff is coming. And this time, the debt is so large, the interest so expensive, and the political system so broken that we might not pull back from the edge. Here's what makes the current situation exponentially more dangerous than 2011: interest rates. From 2008 to 2021, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates at essentially zero. The government borrowed $20 trillion during that period at an average rate of about 2%. The annual interest cost was painful but manageable, between $300 billion and $500 billion per year. This created a dangerous illusion. Politicians convinced themselves that debt didn't matter. Modern monetary theory became fashionable. The idea that countries that borrow in their own currency can never default. They can always print more money. As long as interest rates stayed low, the theory seemed to work. Then came inflation, the worst inflation in 40 years. The Federal Reserve had no choice but to raise rates. From 2022 to 2023, rates went from 0 to 5.5%, the fastest hiking cycle in 4 decades. And here's where the time bomb starts ticking. Every new dollar the government borrows now costs 2 to 3 times more in interest than the debt we already have. But it gets worse, much worse. $7.6 trillion in existing debt matures over the next 12 months. It has to be refinanced. Debt that was borrowed at 2% now has to be rolled over at 5%. That's an additional $228 billion in interest payments every single year. Forever. By 2030, the Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments will reach $1.6 trillion annually. That's more than we'll spend on defense, more than we'll spend on Medicare. Interest will be the single largest item in the federal budget. And this creates what's called a debt spiral. Higher interest payments increase the deficit. Bigger deficits require more borrowing. More borrowing means more interest, which increases the deficit further. Round and round, each cycle making the problem worse. There's no way out of a debt spiral except 3 options: massively raise taxes, massively cut spending, or default. As you'll see, none of those options are actually possible. The trap is already closed. At current interest rates, we're paying 2.4% of GDP just in interest. The Congressional Budget Office projects that will rise to 3.9% of GDP by 2034. The last time interest costs exceeded 3% of GDP was the 1990s, and we had half the debt we have now. We are now in mathematical territory that has never existed before in American history. Now let me show you the 4 triggers that are converging simultaneously. Any one of them could start the cascade. All 4 are already in motion. Trigger 1. Social Security insolvency. The Social Security Trust Fund will be completely depleted in 2033. That's 8 years away. After that date, the system can only pay 77% of promised benefits from incoming tax revenue. That means either benefits get cut by 23% or taxes get raised massively, or the government borrows an additional $3 trillion. There are 70 million baby boomers retiring, 10,000 per day through 2030. The number of workers paying into the system per retiree has collapsed from 5.1 in 1960 to 2.8 today. By 2040, it will be 2.3 workers per retiree. The math doesn't work. The unfunded liability over 75 years is $23 trillion. Nobody in Washington is willing to cut benefits or raise taxes enough to fix it, which means the only option is to borrow. Trigger 2. Medicare bankruptcy. The Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund depletes in 2036. Medicare currently costs $1.7 trillion per year. By 2030, that rises to $2.8 trillion as boomers age into the system. The 75-year unfunded liability for Medicare is $49 trillion. Again, no political will to fix it. Only one option: borrow. Trigger 3. The dollar's reserve currency status is eroding. In the year 2000, 72% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in dollars. Today, that's down to 58%. China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, The BRICS nations are actively creating alternative systems. China and Saudi Arabia are conducting oil deals in yuan instead of dollars. This matters because reserve currency status is what allows America to borrow cheaply. If the world stops needing dollars, demand for Treasury bonds collapses. Foreign holders own $8.5 trillion in U.S. debt. China holds $760 billion, down from $1.3 trillion in 2013. They're actively reducing exposure. Japan holds $1.1 trillion, but Japan itself is drowning in debt at 260% of GDP. If foreign buyers stop purchasing treasuries or worse, start selling, interest rates will spike violently. Trigger 4. U.S. banks are sitting on a treasury time bomb. American banks hold $4.4 trillion in treasury securities. When interest rates spiked in 2022 and 2023, the value of those bonds crashed. Banks are now sitting on over $500 billion in unrealized losses, according to FDIC data. Silicon Valley Bank failed in March 2023 partly because of losses on treasury holdings. If treasury bonds lose more value, more banks fail. And bank failures trigger runs, which trigger more failures. A cascade. These 4 triggers are not hypothetical future events. They are locked in. Social Security insolvency is 8 years away. Medicare is 11. The dollar's decline is happening now. Bank losses are already on the books. The convergence is inevitable. Every debt crisis has 4 possible solutions: raise taxes, cut spending, inflate the debt away, or default. Let me show you why none of these options can work. Option 1. Raise taxes. To balance the federal budget right now, the government would need to raise an additional $1.8 trillion in revenue every single year. The top 1% of earners already pay 42% of all federal income taxes. Their total income is about $3.1 trillion. Even if you taxed them at 100%, confiscated every dollar they earned, it wouldn't close the deficit. You'd need to raise taxes on the middle class. Dramatically. We're talking about doubling tax rates across the board. Political suicide. No party will do it. Congress has a 17% approval rating. The public will not accept massive tax increases to pay for decades of government dysfunction. Option 1 is politically impossible. Option 2. Cut spending. Mandatory spending. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt totals $4.1 trillion. That's 65% of the budget. You cannot cut it without changing the law. And politically, cutting benefits to 67 million Social Security recipients is not happening. That leaves discretionary spending, $1.7 trillion. Half of that is defense, $850 billion. Cutting defense meaningfully would collapse America's global position and probably trigger wars. The other half, $850 billion, covers everything else: education, infrastructure, the FBI, NASA, the entire federal government outside of entitlements and military. To balance the budget through spending cuts alone, you'd have to eliminate 100% of discretionary spending. Shut down the entire government. And it still wouldn't be enough because the deficit is $1.8 trillion. Discretionary spending is only $1.7 trillion. Option 2 is mathematically impossible. Option 3. Inflate the debt away. The Federal Reserve could print money to buy Treasury bonds. They already did this. $5 trillion from 2020 to 2021 through quantitative easing. By mid-2022, inflation hit 9.1%, the worst in 40 years. While multiple factors drove inflation, including supply chain disruptions and energy shocks, the flood of printed money amplified the crisis. Printing another $10 trillion to $20 trillion would cause runaway inflation, possibly hyperinflation. Weimar Germany tried this in 1923 to pay war debts. The currency collapsed. Zimbabwe tried it in 2008. Inflation hit 89.7 sextillion%. Venezuela tried it recently. Their currency is worthless. Once high inflation starts, it's almost impossible to control without causing a severe recession. The Fed would face an impossible choice: save the government's ability to borrow or save the currency. You can't do both. If they print enough to prevent default, the dollar collapses. If they don't print, the government defaults. Option 3 destroys the currency. Option 4, default. U.S. Treasury bonds are the foundation of the entire global financial system. Banks use them as collateral for trillions in loans. Pension funds hold them as safe assets. Money market funds are backed by them. A U.S. default would trigger immediate bank failures, pension fund collapses, money market runs, and a crash in every financial market simultaneously. It would be 2008 times 10. Federal Reserve officials warned in 2013 that a Treasury default could trigger economic consequences rivaling the Great Depression, with immediate bank failures and frozen credit markets. Option 4 destroys the financial system. So let's review. Can't tax enough. Can't cut enough. Can't inflate without destroying the currency. Can't default without destroying the system. There is no solution. The debt trap is closed. Now let me show you how concentrated this risk is. 6 institutions hold the key to whether America survives or collapses. First, the Federal Reserve. It owns $4.8 trillion in Treasury bonds. The Fed already printed $5 trillion between 2008 and 2021 to buy government debt. Its balance sheet is 10 times larger than before 2008. If there's another crisis, the Fed is out of ammunition. Printing more risks hyperinflation. Second, the Social Security Trust Fund. It holds $2.7 trillion in special Treasury bonds. These are IOUs from the government to itself. When the trust fund depletes in 2033, it must redeem those bonds. That forces the government to borrow even more at exactly the moment it's already under maximum stress. Third, China. It holds $760 billion in treasuries. China has reduced its holdings by 42% since 2013. It's using treasury holdings as geopolitical leverage. If relations worsen, China could dump bonds to punish American policy. That would send interest rates spiking. Fourth, Japan. It holds $1.1 trillion, the largest foreign holder. But Japan itself is in a debt crisis with debt at 260% of GDP. Japan is being forced to raise interest rates for the first time in decades. To do that, it may need to sell U.S. treasuries to fund its own needs. If Japan sells, rates spike. Fifth, U.S. banks. They hold $4.4 trillion in treasuries. They're already sitting on over $500 billion in unrealized losses from the rate increases of 2022 and 2023. Another spike in rates means more losses. More losses mean bank failures. Bank failures mean contagion. Sixth, money market funds. They hold $6.3 trillion marketed to investors as safe as cash. They're backed almost entirely by Treasury bonds and repurchase agreements. In 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, one money market fund broke the buck, meaning it couldn't return $1 for every dollar invested. It triggered panic and runs. The next Treasury crisis will cause the same thing. Except this time, there are $6.3 trillion in these funds. And here's the problem. These 6 institutions are all interconnected. The Fed buys treasuries, which props up prices, which prevents bank losses, which keeps money markets stable, which allows the government to keep borrowing. It's a circular system. If any one link breaks, the entire chain collapses. The Fed can't print without causing inflation. Banks can't absorb more losses. China and Japan are unreliable. Social Security is running out. Money markets are one shock away from breaking. The system is held together by the assumption that nothing will go wrong. But everything is about to go wrong. Let me show you exactly when and how this breaks. First quarter 2025, the debt ceiling suspension expires. Congress must vote to raise the limit or the government defaults within weeks. The House Republican majority is razor thin. Hardline members are demanding spending cuts as the price for their votes. Democrats will refuse. We've seen this before, but this time the debt is $37 trillion instead of $14 trillion. Even if they raise the ceiling, the fight itself signals to global markets that America's political system is dysfunctional. Bond yields rise. Borrowing costs increase. 2025 to 2026, the refinancing crisis hits. $7.6 trillion in existing debt matures in 2025. Another $9.8 trillion matures in 2026. That's $17.4 trillion that must be refinanced in just 24 months. Debt that was issued at 2% interest must now be rolled over at 5%. That adds over $500 billion per year in interest costs. Permanently, the Treasury must sell an enormous amount of new bonds into the market. If demand is weak, if foreign buyers step back, if banks can't absorb more, yields spike even higher. A failed Treasury auction would be the signal that the market has lost confidence. 2027 to 2028, interest becomes the largest expenditure in the federal budget, projected at $1.6 trillion annually by 2030, but it could hit that sooner if rates stay elevated. At that point, interest costs exceed Social Security, they exceed defense, they exceed Medicare. Every other priority gets squeezed. Congress faces an impossible choice. Cut defense and risk geopolitical collapse. Cut entitlements and face voter revolt. Or borrow even more and accelerate the death spiral. 2029 to 2033. The entitlement cliff arrives. Social Security's trust fund fully depletes in 2033. Benefits must be cut 23% or the government must borrow another $3 trillion immediately. 80 million retirees depend on Social Security. Half of them rely on it for more than 50% of their income. The political pressure to borrow will be overwhelming. But at that point, the debt will likely exceed $50 trillion. Interest costs will be over $2 trillion per year. The market will have reached its breaking point. Now here's how the cascade actually happens. It doesn't require all these triggers to hit. It only requires one to start the chain reaction. A debt ceiling breach that lasts too long. A failed Treasury auction where there aren't enough buyers. A wave of regional bank failures from Treasury losses. A foreign holder, China or Japan, dumping bonds. Any of these events causes Treasury yields to spike. Higher yields mean banks holding Treasuries face bigger losses. Banks start failing. Money market funds break the buck. Runs begin. The Fed is forced to choose. Print money to buy Treasuries and cause inflation, or let the system collapse into deflation and depression. Either choice leads to disaster. If they print, the dollar plunges, inflation spikes to 15% or 20%, imports become unaffordable, and real wages collapse. If they don't print, banks fail, credit freezes, unemployment hits 15% to 20%, and we enter a depression. The window for this cascade is 18 to 24 months, multiple triggers converging simultaneously. The system is so fragile that any significant shock will propagate through the entire network within days. What it means for you. Now let me tell you what this actually means for your life, your savings. If the government tries to inflate its way out of this crisis, the dollar will lose 30% to 50% of its purchasing power. The money sitting in your bank account, your savings, will buy half of what it buys today. If they don't inflate and we go into depression, your savings might be safe in nominal terms, but they'll be trapped in failed banks. The FDIC, the agency that insures deposits, has only $125 billion in its insurance fund. Total insured deposits in America are $10.5 trillion. The FDIC can cover 1.2% of insured deposits. In 2008, the FDIC fund dropped to just $15 billion and needed a Treasury backstop to survive. In the next crisis, there won't be a backstop large enough. Your paycheck. In the inflation scenario, prices explode while wages lag. Your $50,000 salary buys what $35,000 bought the year before. Gas hits $8 per gallon. Groceries double. Rent increases 40%. Your standard of living collapses even though you're still employed. In the depression scenario, unemployment hits 15% to 20%. If you lose your job, there are no jobs to find. Businesses are failing because credit markets are frozen. Recovery takes a decade. Your 401k and retirement. The stock market crashes 40% to 60% when the debt crisis hits. Treasury crisis means everything crashes. Stocks, bonds, real estate. The average 401k balance is $125,000. In a 50% crash, that becomes $60,500. If you're near retirement, you can't recover. You work another 10 years or you retire in poverty. Pension funds, which hold trillions in treasuries, face catastrophic losses. State and corporate pensions that are already underfunded go completely insolvent. Retirees see benefits cut 30% to 50%. Your Social Security. In 2033, benefits get cut 23% unless the government borrows trillions more. But if they borrow trillions more, they trigger the debt crisis sooner. Either way, you're not getting what you were promised. 67 million Americans receive Social Security. 48% of retirees depend on it for more than half their income. When it gets cut, millions fall into poverty, your bank account. If Treasury crisis triggers bank failures, you could face losses on uninsured deposits. When large banks fail, depositors above the FDIC limit have no protection. In Cyprus in 2013, large depositors lost up to 47% in bank bail-ins. While U.S. law differs, the Dodd-Frank Act gives regulators authority to impose losses on creditors and large depositors of failed systemic banks. Your deposits above the FDIC limit are at risk, even below the limit. If enough banks fail simultaneously, FDIC can't cover everyone. The real danger is the cascading effects. Credit cards stop working. ATMs run out of cash. Businesses can't make payroll. Supply chains break because there's no credit for shipping. Shortages of food, medicine, fuel. The economy doesn't just slow down, it seizes up completely, and then comes the social breakdown. Crime spikes as unemployment soars. Political extremism on both left and right gains power. protests, riots. The government responds with authoritarian measures. This isn't speculation. This is what happens in every debt crisis throughout history when the numbers get too large and the solutions run out. Let me show you the pattern. Every empire that debased its currency or borrowed beyond its means eventually collapsed. Rome inflated its currency to pay the military. The empire fell in 476 AD. Spain borrowed against New World gold and defaulted 4 times in 40 years. 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596. France printed assignats to pay its debts in the 1790s. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency and triggered revolution. Britain was the world's reserve currency for over a century. Debt from 2 world wars forced it to hand that status to America. The Soviet Union couldn't sustain its military spending. It collapsed in 1991. The United States is not special. The math doesn't care about American exceptionalism. This time is different are the 4 most dangerous words in finance. Every debtor in history believed they could grow their way out. Every reserve currency believed its status was permanent. None of them were right. The math always wins. Here's what we know with certainty. $37 trillion in debt. $1.2 trillion in annual interest payments right now. $1.8 trillion deficits continuing forever under current policy. $17.4 trillion in debt that must be refinanced in the next 24 months. Social Security insolvent in 8 years. Medicare insolvent in 11. The dollar losing reserve status. Banks holding $500 billion in unrealized losses. 4 options to solve it, all impossible. Can't tax enough. Can't cut enough. Can't inflate without destroying the currency. Can't default without destroying the financial system. Multiple triggers converging between 2025 and 2033. Zero political will to make hard choices. No mathematical solution that doesn't involve massive pain. The only question left is not if the debt crisis happens. The only questions are when and how hard. The most likely timeline is 18 to 24 months. The magnitude will be worse than 2008, possibly worse than 1929, because the system is bigger, more leveraged, and more fragile than any point in history. Warren Buffett called derivatives financial weapons of mass destruction. He should have included sovereign debt. A $37 trillion debt bomb sits at the center of the global financial system. When it detonates, there is no bailout large enough. No central bank powerful enough. No policy response fast enough. You cannot fix a debt crisis caused by too much debt by creating more debt. The mathematics don't work. The politics won't allow solutions. The triggers are appearing right now. This is not a prediction. This is arithmetic. One slip. A failed Treasury auction. A debt ceiling breach. A foreign holder dumping bonds. A wave of bank failures. Any one of these, and America falls off the fiscal cliff. And when America falls, the entire world falls with it. The question is not whether you are in it. You are already in it. The only question is whether you are ready for the moment when the ground disappears.